A beautiful day to you. This is Rhonda reading part 4.1 on Mythmaking and the Christ, read from the book The Lost Gospel, the Book of Q, and Christian Origins by Burton L. Mack. Mythmaking and the Christ. An explosion of the collective imagination signals change, and the first Christian century experienced such an explosion it marks the time as an uncertain and it registers an outpouring of human energy and intellectual activity in the production of myths. Christians were not the only people creating new myths. The literature of the time is famous for its fantastic worlds and imaginary explanations of legendary figures. But Christians were the ones who managed the mythology that Western culture eventually accepted as its own. Christians have never been comfortable with the notion of myth or willing to see their own myths as the product of human imagination and intellectual labor. This strong resistance is not due to a perversity peculiar to Christians, but is a peculiarity integral to the Christian myth itself. The Christian myth was generated in a social experiment, aware of its recent beginnings, and because the myth was about those beginnings, early Christians imagined their myth as history. The myth focused on the importance of Jesus as the founder figure of the movements, congregations, and institutions Christians were forming. Thus, history and myth were fused into a single characterization, and the myths of origin were written and imagined as having happened at a recent time and in a specific place. Christians of the second, third, and fourth centuries found themselves troubled by the resemblance of their myths to both Greek and Jewish mythologies. They could distance themselves from these other cultures and distinguish their myths from the others only by emphasizing the recent historical setting of their myths and the impression given by the narrative gospels that the myths really happened. So they carried on a running debate among themselves about what to call their stories of Jesus. There were two terms in Greek that constantly came to mind as the appropriate description for such stories, namely mythos and logos. These were considered dangerous mythos because it was commonly used for imaginary inventions, not histories, and logos because it was a common term for a story about the Greek and pagan gods. Christians consistently eschewed the term mythos and they used the term logos only in a specific connotation. Logos was used in the sense Hellenistic Jews had given the term when referring to the way in which wisdom was present in the written and remembered epic of Israel. Instead, by clever linguistic finesse, the historical development of what we do not have the leisure to follow in this book, Christians used the Greek term pistis. I hope I said that right, or pistis. I think it's pistis, which means both faith and faithless, as well as trust and trustworthiness, in ways that eventually made it possible to use the Latin term credo, believe, for a succinct summary of the main events in narrative gospels. Credo first was used as a verb since those who would be Christians were asked to say that they believed the gospel story in its shorthand version as the statement of faith. But soon the statement of faith itself was called credo, or the creed basic to the Christian faith. No other religion demands that its adherents say they believe in their myth. And as a matter of fact, it is not necessary to believe in a myth or a story for it to have its effect on imagination. As with any story, myths project an imaginary world in which a people see themselves reflected at a distance. Idealization and the abstraction of values create images that take on objective status. But they actually function as concentrated symbols of the forces at play in people's social experience. These forces need to be acknowledged, managed, and shared with the next generation of its members. It takes a lot of living together and talking to achieve a common mythology and use it for cultural inculcation. A myth projects the agreements that have been reached about the proper way to do things and what to value in human relationships. By a marvelous use of the metaphor, dislocation, and visual transformation, myth combines these agreements with a people's memory, traditions, and recasts its history as a storied world. The world it describes functions to remind a people that they are not the first to have lived where they do and the way they do. Although a myth is the product of a people's social experience and best judgments, it tells a people that the world they live in is not their creation, but has already been inhabited. Excuse me. The codes, arrangements, and patterns of authority are already set. Myths frequently tell about the time when those arrangements first were made. Once a myth is in place and the social world is stable, it is possible to take the myth for granted and depend upon it being there in everyone's mind. One can then tell other stories that play upon the larger frame of reference. The mythic world can become a field of play for further imaginative elaboration, reflecting upon the relationships it proposes among the agents of its story. Other stories set in current time and place can then be used to explore the details, complexities, and limitations of a significant human relationship or exchange, assuming the larger mythic world as backdrop without ever having to mention it. Think of the cinema and the way in which it satisfies or tweaks us by telling a story that works out right or one that presses the limits of our sensibilities about human and social relationships. The standard for a story to be good or to engage us fully in exploration of some human relationship is always some myth we hold in common, such as the American dream or the taking of the West or the mountain man's quest. But when the patterns of a society change and cultures collide, a myth already in place comes under considerable pressure. Because myth is an imaginary construct, and because it is dense in symbolism and peopled by extravagantly ideal figures, the mythic world itself can be explored and rearranged in the hopes of finding some new perspective that can clarify the times. In the course of Christian history, to take one example of a series of social and cultural shifts, the Christ has been refigured many times over. In the period before Constantine, when bishops were taking their place as the leaders of the churches, the Christ was commonly depicted as the good shepherd who could guide the flock to its heavenly home. After Constantine, the Christ was pictured as the victor over death and the ruler of the world. During the medieval period, when the church was the primary vehicle of both social and cultural tradition, the story of Christ's ascent from the cross or the tomb to the seat of sovereignty, judgment, and salvation in heaven focused the Christian imagination on a Christ of a truly comprehensive three-decker world. Somewhat later, we see the Gothic Christ appear, and then the Christ of the crucifix, the man of Galilee, the cosmic Christ, the feminine Christ, and so on. In every case, the rearrangements were necessary in order to adjust the mythic world to new social constraints and cultural systems of knowledge. Myths can be rearranged because they project a narrative universe. The edges of a mythic world are always vague and vulnerable to the intrusion of alien figures. Myths are set in the past, and many tell of time when the world as presently experienced came into being. All peoples are aware of the time between the mythic events and their own time. And there are many ways of reorganizing and accounting for what we in Western culture have called tradition or history. Any and all of these relations between a myth and some actual social situation are subject to the resignification and rearrangement. When a society excuse me, when a social history introduces changes in the structure of a society and its patterns of activity, the function of a myth is challenged because it no longer depicts how the present state of affairs came to be. Such a challenge demands that both the myth and the new social configuration be rethought. In Western tradition and in antiquity, where myth is linked primarily to an epic history, a particular method of rearranging symbols or myth making has been the rule. The epic is reviewed in relation to the current situation, and depending on one's sense of the tension between them, particular events from the epic are chosen as paradigms for reflecting upon the present. A golden age, for instance, may be revised and then held up as a contrast to the present situation as critique, program, or utopian ideal. In the case of social fragmentation and the collusion of many cultures, such as that experienced by all peoples during the Greco Roman age, no single epic tradition becomes a model for new patterns of social activity. And yet, these patterns must be linked up with the past. Some measure of novelty is allowed because of obvious changes in circumstance. But the new pattern cannot be seen as a brand new without violating a group's awareness of being in a world long since inhabited. And so the process of social formation includes working out agreements, settling on symbols, and projecting a mythic time frame. A group needs to do this in order to identify its place vis-a-vis the surrounding cultures and to claim legitimacy as an appropriate response to the times. This response will be judged in relation to the best traditions of the previous histories of the peoples and cultures that have converged. We have traced one tradition of social experimentation and myth making among the followers of Jesus. The Jesus people first imagined the society to be structured on the Hellenistic model of a school and the tradition of a teacher. At every turn in social experience and its accompanying shift in discourse, Jesus was reimagined. But revising and compounding the roles of their teacher was not the only factor at work in this process. The group was also at work on the question of the ideal social order they wanted to represent. They noted how they differed from other groups and social configurations and where they overlapped with the ideals of cultural traditions that were no longer locatable as dominant in the social histories of their times. And they wondered how they might lay claim to those ideals as their heritage. Working with a minimal set of symbols, Jesus, as their founder teacher, had to represent the link with and the present incarnation of all the valuable symbols they had gleaned while sorting through what was remembered and valued from the past. Others naturally read those same or similar histories in ways that supported their own experimentations with social formations. Thus, all of the epics, Greek, Syrian, Egyptian, Roman, and a myriad of illustrious social traditions, as well as the Jewish, Samaritan, and Northern Israel traditions, became prizes over which ideological battles raged. As with the recent debates in America about the original intention of the Constitution, different groups laying claim to the same epic traditions were thrust into ideological competition. Those with the least claim on an epic tradition would naturally be the most threatened and the most likely to engage in hostile polemics against those whose positions of privilege argued for another interpretation. It is primarily for this reason that early Christians developed such a strong polemic against their Jewish competitors for claims upon the Epic of Israel. The discovery of Q has made it possible to identify several first century junctures in the social and ideological histories of closely related groups of Jesus people. At the beginning, as we have seen, there was no need and therefore little interest in sorting through any epic tradition in order to claim legitimacy for the groups that formed. Jesus was remembered as a cynic sage whose insights were immediately accepted and whose importance lay in the obvious success of his type of discourse that challenged others to consider a change of lifestyle. The first attempt to borrow from an epic tradition was occasioned by internal and social stress and was performed in a thoroughly defensive fashion. There was no need to enhance Jesus' importance by portraying him as a prophet on the model of the prophets of Israel. The people of Q simply usurped the epic of their detractors and read it against them. Get off our backs. Your own history should tell you that what we represent is critical voice in unhealthy times and has always been needed. See, we are okay, even on your own terms. But of course, having found a way to see the movement reflected in the epic traditions, this myth making strategy was in place when loyalty to the group became an issue and its borders had to be marked. We have followed the development of a Jesus mythology that drew upon the popular figure of personified wisdom. Wisdom mythology was used to shift from a characterization of Jesus as a teacher to one that imagined Jesus first as an envoy of the divine agent in Israel's history and then as a kind of prophet. In this characterization, the notion of a line of prophets could work both ways, polemically and constructively. It could serve as a polemic both against an establishment Judaism that read the epic as an ideology for the Second Temple state, the advantage Mark took, and against the Pharisaic definition of Judaism that read the epic as a charter for the ethical and ritual laws of purity. The advantage of that Q2, the Thomas people and Luke took. On the constructive side, imagining Jesus as an envoy of wisdom in the role of a prophet teacher enhanced his importance and thus the importance of his teachings for Q2, the Thomas people and Luke. It even made it possible for Q3 and Matthew to fudge on the earlier polemic against the Pharisees, use the prophet motif merely as a predictive device, and reinterpret the teachings of Jesus as thoroughly compatible with Pharisaic law. The conclusions to be drawn from the story of Q are therefore obvious. The followers of Jesus were normal human beings, responding to their times in understandable ways, investing intellectual energy in in evolving social experiments and developing mythologies, just as any society in the making does. As for methods and means toward the creation of a mythic universe, the Jesus people also performed according to normal patterns. They assessed their social and cultural context with critical care, laid claim to the cultural traditions most relevant and ready at hand, sorted out the combinations most appropriate to their movement, and borrowed creatively from the mythologies current at the time. The importance of these conclusions for a revision of Christian origins is enormous. Q's story puts the Jesus movements in the center of the picture as the dominant form of early group formations in the wake of Jesus, and it forces the modern historian to have another look at the congregation of the Christ. The congregations of the Christ will now have to be accounted for as a particular development within the Jesus movements, not as the earliest form of Christian persuasion and standard against which the Jesus movements have appeared as diluted accommodations to banal mentalities. The history of the Q movement demonstrates that several mythologies of Jesus as a divine agent were possible without any recourse to martyrological notions. The mythology of Jesus as an envoy of wisdom, or even as the manifest incarnation of wisdom's child, was not generated by any experience or notion of Jesus' resurrection from the dead. It was, as we have seen, generated in the course of myth making in the genre of the teachings of a teacher. The discovery of Q also cautions us about the traditional view that Christianity emerged as a reformation of the religion of Judaism. Even the appeal to the Epic of Israel was an ad hoc strategy that was not integral to the primary motivations of the Jesus movement. Other ideological resources were as much in play, including popular forms of Hellenistic philosophy and the mythology of wisdom. The attraction of the new community was not rooted in a plan to reform a religious tradition that had missed its calling, or in a clarion call to start a new world religion based on a recent revelation, but in the enhancement of human values experienced in the process of social formation itself. In the midst of the large, unmanageable world of confusing cultures and social histories, a small group of like minded individuals would have been its own attraction. Such a group would have provided a forum for new ideas. A sense of critical distance from the world would not have meant that positive attractions within the group were lacking or that constructive proposals for ordering their social relationships would not have been forthcoming. Heady thoughts such as representing the rule of God as an alternative to the kingdoms of the world were possible. But at the core of this attraction was the idea that a mixed group of people could represent the best of heritage of several ethnically exclusive cultural traditions and claim to be a new kind of community. The evidence for for a multi-ethnic constituency in the Q traditions is sparse, mainly because the Jewish Galilean issue dominated the terms of the group's response to social rejection. Not only because the Q communities were close to persons who were not of Jewish ethnic extraction, The mood of the group was not generated by ethical loyalties, and evidence of a multi ethnic, multicultural mix prepares us for the understanding the spread of the Jesus movement to settings where the mix of people surfaced for celebration and then became an issue, as well as for the eventual formation of a network of Jesus Christian groups as a new Hellenistic religion. Mark, Thomas, Luke, and even Matthew provide strong evidence for the mix of peoples characteristic of the Jesus movements, and the mythology of the Christ cult is understandable only on the basis of a multi ethnic, cross cultural movement. The Q people were not the only group that formed within the Jesus movement. To take five additional groups as an example of the experimental nature of the Jesus movement, there is some evidence for one, a group of Jesus people distinguished by its allegiance to Jesus's family; two, Jewish followers who took up residence in Jerusalem for a time; three, the people who designed sets of five miracle stories as their myth of origin; the Jesus movement, in which Mark was at home and in which the pronouncement story genre was highly developed; and five, the tradition within which Luke was at home, a tradition with a sketchy history, but one in which a distinctively human view of Jesus prevailed. All of these groups, with the exception of Luke's, are discussed in my book, A Myth of Innocence, 1988, from which the following brief descriptions are taken. The sets of five miracle stories for which we have evidence in the Gospels of both Mark and John are particularly interesting as an example of myth making in the Jesus movement. The sets include a sea crossing miracle at the beginning and a feeding miracle story at the end. In between are three miracles of healing, focusing on socially marginal people in impossible circumstances and including at least one Gentile. Scholars have traced the design of these sets of five miracle stories to motifs from the miracles of the Exodus tradition and the healings of the Elisha cycle. Thus, we have another example of Jesus people thinking of themselves on the model of an epic precedent. It is important to see that there is not the slightest hint of any polemic against Jewish claims to these traditions. There is instead a sense of delight in imagining that a mixed constituency of Jesus people could be thought of as a group constituted on the Exodus model. Look, that's us. It's great, seems to be the message. The pre-Markan pronouncement stories, on the other hand, show that Mark's group of Jesus people somehow became fixated with the issue of whether the Pharisaic codes of purity applied to the Jesus movement. Their answers clearly was no, but the extravagant arguments against the Pharisees in these stories show that the debate had been carried on for some time and was taken quite seriously. The pronouncement stories contain numerous hints that during the first phase of this tradition, Jesus was remembered for an aphoristic wisdom, much like that reflected in Q1. And in the course of this group's history, the voice of Jesus eventually took on an absolute authority as it did in Q2. However, the issues underlying the debate called for arguments and pronouncements that were quite different from the simple charges against the Pharisees in Q2. In Mark's group, Jesus' authority was not derived from a wisdom mythology, but attributed to his skill in argumentation. Thus, they did not picture Jesus as wisdom's child, but as an accomplished rhetor, a lawyer for the defense of the Jesus people who knew the law but outfoxed the Pharisees in argument at every turn. He did this as the champion for the legitimacy of a group composed of people who, by Pharisaic standards, were ritually impure. An altogether different mythology developed in the congregations of the Christ, known to us from the letters of Paul. This mythology is the one most familiar to modern Christians, for it focuses on Jesus' death as a saving event and includes the notion of his resurrection to cosmic lordship. New Testament scholars call this mythology it's spelled Kerygma. I'm going to pronounce it as kerygma for short. For that is what Paul said Christians preached. Kerygma means proclamation. The kerygma developed in the congregations of Jesus, people in northern Syria, Antioch and beyond, and appears to have overshadowed, if not erased, the memories and importance of Jesus as a teacher. Only the faintest suggestion of having started as a Jesus movement can be discerned in the thought and practice of these congregations, even though it must have been from the Jesus people who spread to northern Syria that the Christ cults emerged. The transformation of a Jesus movement into a Christ congregation is signaled with the term Christ. Christ, not Jesus, was the name that came to be used for the one who was crucified and raised. But why? In Greek, the term was a common adjective that meant smeared or anointed, as with oil or ointment. It was never used as a name and had no special significance in that culture. So the term Christ must have been used in the sense of Messiah, the Hebrew term for anointed. In Jewish tradition, anointed had the additional connotation of installation to royal or priestly office. Why would the Christ congregation have used it if, as we have seen, the Jesus movement had not thought of Jesus as a Messiah? The term Christ came into use during the myth-making process that resulted in the kerygma. It was a concept that could relate both to the idea of the kingdom of God common to the Jesus movement, as well as to the idea of Jesus as the king of the kingdom of God, as represented by the congregations of the Christ. As understood in the Jesus movements, the kingdom of God did not call for a Messiah. In the Christ cults, however, the congregations thought of themselves as a realm over which Jesus as the Christ presently ruled. Thus, the term Christ soon became only another name for their God. If we are able to reconstruct the logic by which Jesus came to be thought of as a God with a right to rule over these communities, we may be able to understand why Christ was chosen for his new name. The clue to the logic of the kerygma lies in the phrase that Christ died, quote unquote, for us, namely the congregation of Christians. Such a notion cannot be traced to old Jewish and or Israelite traditions. For the very idea of a vicarious human sacrifice was anathema in these cultures, but it can easily be traced to a strong Greek tradition of extolling a noble death. The tradition has its roots in the idea that a warrior dies for his country, its laws, or its people. In the case of Socrates, the noble death notion was applied to a philosopher teacher who died for the truth of his vision for the very city that condemned him to death. During the Hellenistic and Roman periods, the Socratic ideal became the prime model for ethical integrity, and facing death, especially at the hands of a tyrant, was considered the ultimate test of one's philosophical and ethical commitment. When leading teachers and court counselors suffered banishment or execution, the notion of the noble death immediately came to mind as the standard that was used to assess and eulogize the mettle of all martyrs. The notion of a resurrection from the dead, on the other hand, offended Hellenistic sensibility. It was a new notion, entertained in desperation by Jewish authors who were struggling with the question of theod- theo- theodicy, spelled Theodicy. Again, I apologize for any mispronouncements. I'm going to have them, and I'm going to apologize. Um, so it was a new notion entertained in desperation by Jewish authors who were struggling with the question of theodicy, or the problem of justice, in the case of the righteous being killed by those in power who had no right to rule. As an idea, it was born in the fusion of an apocalyptic imagination with an age-old narrative plot, sometimes called a wisdom tale. This tale turned on the reversal of two trial scenes. An innocent Jewish victim was charged with a disloyalty to a foreign king and condemned to prisoner death, but was later rescued and vindicated when it was discovered that his wisdom and Jewish loyalties were not seditious, but greatly beneficial to the king and his people. Familiar examples are the Joseph story, Esther, and the Daniel tales. When a realistic assessment of the times forbade a naive telling of this story and the apocalyptic projection of a future vindication for the righteous was imagined, the wisdom tale was given a new twist. Even if the innocent victim was killed, there would still be a retrial and thorough vindication, together with a reversal of circumstance after death. Various views of transformation were possible at this point, including immediate ascension and or an eventual resurrection from the dead. The wisdom story and the model of the noble martyr merged in a martyrological literature that memorialized the history of the Maccabees, 2 and 4 Maccabees, and fascinated others such as Philo and the author of the Wisdom of Solomon. This happened in Hellenistic Jewish circles from northern Syria to Alexandria. The Jesus people in northern Syria embraced this mythology and applied it to their own situation. They were aware that their association, a mix of peoples from disparate cultures, which Paul reduced to the two categories of Jew and Gentile, was without precedent. For those who had responded to Jesus' vision of living by the rule of God, the thought that he died as a martyr for their cause would not have been an impossible first step. But as with other Jesus movements born in the cross currents of Palestinian traditions and Hellenistic culture, and repeatedly bumping up against the strong presence and articulate intellectual force of Jewish involvement from within and Jewish critique from without, The Jewish questions of Gentile participation in a mixed congregation was raised. Could the notion of Jesus as a martyr answer such a question? This martyrology was enhanced with three additional notions. One was that the God whose kingdom they represented was the God storied in the Epic of Israel. If Jesus had died for the cause of that God's rule, the congregation could think of itself as a new configuration of Israel, the people of God fully justified, though including Gentiles. Another notion was that God raised Jesus from the dead as a vindication for his faithfulness to the cause for which he had died. It might be considered an audacious presumption for Christians to have imagined that a certain God was intentionally involved in the destiny of Jesus and to have assumed to know what that God thought about Jesus's crucifixion and resurrection. And yet, that is what mythic thinking allows. Creating such a martyrology was actually no different than creating a mythology of Jesus as the child of divine wisdom. Both mythologies dared to gain the Archimedean point of view necessary for the placement of Jesus Christ at the center of a world with horizons vast enough to be considered universal. The third edition followed from this theological twist on their martyrology, namely that Jesus was recognized by God as the rightful heir to his kingdom. The idea of the Son of God as heir to his Father's kingdom was available in many Hellenistic mythologies. Thus, the enhancement of Jesus' mythological role can be understood as a shift from Jesus as the child of wisdom, or the righteous one whom wisdom rescued, to the Son of God whom God designated as king. The shift can be thought of as a simple move if one sees it at the formal level of rearranging related symbols in the system. This is the end of the year 2024, and why does some of this stuff sound so familiar to current events? Just a little side note. However, the consequences at the level of the recharacterization of Jesus's mythological role were stupendous. The move turned a prophet teacher into a divine sovereign. No longer would Jesus' authority be experienced as a voice of instruction and judgment from the past. He would now be a king who would execute his authority over the congregation in the present. And since resurrection meant ascending into heaven, the Jesus people came to think of Jesus as a God. The Christ was installed as ruler of God's world and Lord of God's people. With such a dramatic mythology focused on the death and resurrection of Jesus as the Christ, the congregations of the Christ no longer needed to cultivate the memories of Jesus as a teacher. The Christ myth created a much more fantastic imaginary universe than anything encountered in the Jesus traditions. The myth is also curious and ironic from a modern historian's point of view. A Jewish question about the social constitution of the Jesus movement was answered by a combination of Greek and Jewish narrative logics, neither of which would have been attractive to the other cultures' traditional mentality. That irony is strong evidence for the multi-ethnic mix and multicultural ethos of the new congregations. Note that the God in question need not be thought of as the private property of the Jews, although Paul, as a Jew, thought of God that way. Christians probably thought of Jesus' father as the God of overlapping epic traditions common to Jews, Samaritans, and Galileans alike. There is also no indication that the Christ's people thought of Jesus as having been killed by the Jewish establishment, or that God's vindication of his martyrdom therefore intended a judgment on the Jews. In distinction from the narrative Gospels, the Kerygma did not situate the death and resurrection of Jesus in a specific time and place. The Kerygma was simply, quote unquote, that Christ died for the kingdom and was raised as its king. The logic would not have worked equally for all parties of the mixed congregation if the tyrants who killed Jesus had been named and blamed. Thus, the event of the cross and resurrection was dislodged from the social circumstance and placed in a thoroughly mythological once upon a time. Hellenized Jews think of the myth in terms of the wisdom tale. Greeks could imagine the resurrection on the model of apotheosis or of Greek or of the translation and transformation of a hero into a god. The evidence from Paul's letters is that the congregations of the Christ were attractive associations and that their emerging mythology was found to be exciting. A spirited cult formed on the model of the mystery religions, complete with entrance baptisms, rites of recognition, the holy kiss, ritualized meals, the Lord's Supper, the notion of the spiritual presence of the Lord, and the creation of liturgical materials such as acclamations, doxologies, confessions of faith, and Christ hymns. It was a new religious society celebrating freedom from cultural traditions and the personal experience of transcending social constraints by means of induction into a mythic world centered in a symbol of transcendence and transformation. It was in the Christ cult, not in the Jesus movement, that the Christian notion of conversion as a personal transformation emerged. The notion seems simple, but it depends on a highly developed collective imagination that sharply distinguishes the ethos of a community from its larger social world. In the case of the congregations of Christ, a spirited ethos and its mythic world were joined and conceptualized on the Greek model of a sphere of being, most often called a cosmos, ordered world. Sometimes an aeon, vast, all encompassing age. Christians imagined that their ethos was a cosmic order of existence created by the Christ, and therefore there were two aeons available for human habitation. The difference between these aeons was variously described as new, old, heavenly, worldly, spiritual, fleshly, or even divine, demonic. It was this conceptuality that allowed Paul to develop the notion of the church as the body of the cosmic Christ and described the experience of joining a Christian congregation in terms of conversion, forgiveness, freedom, transference, transformation, and new creation. Such a conceptuality is further evidence of the strong sense of identity achieved in these groups. But of course, inhabiting such a mythic world, even as an ethos that required social congregation, was dangerously close to living in a bubble world whose only attachment to social reality was a flotation on the surface of its currents. One might think that such an extravagant mythology would surely mark the outside limits of Christian imagination. Not so. The stakes were apparently felt to be high, the rewards of the new religion worthy of further intellectual investment, and the cross cultural mix of mythologies heady. One could write a poem to celebrate the cosmic event and have it sung by the congregation. One could declaim on the benefits released by the spiritual presence of the congregation's Lord. Social intercourse in a world governed only by the spirit of freedom must have been enticing, to say the least. There was still much to experience, think about, and do. The Christ myth was an extremely complex symbol capable of further elaboration. The New Testament letter to the Ephesians is a meditation on the cosmic order created by the Christ, a poetry of praise, wonderment, and thanksgiving, and a prayer for an increase of the wisdom and insight required to understand its heights and depths of the mystery. The letter to the Hebrews is an even more preposterous elaboration of the Christ myth. The vicarious aspect of the martyr's death, uh, quote unquote, for some cause, invited elaboration as a sacrifice. And the author of the letter to the Hebrews did not hesitate to interpret Jesus' death as better even than the sacrifice of the erstwhile Jewish high priests on the Day of Atonement. It was better because Jesus was the Son of God, not a human high priest who performed the sacrifice once for all, not repeatedly, and offered himself as the sacrifice, not some other sacrificial victim. This thought, the author of Hebrews said, should help Christians take comfort during their trials and think of themselves as living within the forecourt of the great cosmic temple of God, with all eyes on the veil behind which the timeless self sacrifice of the Son of God was being performed on their behalf. Modern sensibility may not this image Modern sensibility may not find this image as helpful as the author of Hebrews thought it would be. The difference between the Jesus movements and their mythologies and the congregations of the Christ and their mythology should now be clear. One important contrast is that between a focus on the instructions of a teacher and the dramatic event of a martyr's death and resurrection. Another is that the mythic worlds of the Jesus movements placed Jesus in epic and historical time and place. In the Christ cults, the founding event resisted location in historical time and place and was imagined to have created a spiritual or noetic world detached from the social and environmental orders. With such a difference in social sensibilities and mythologies, one would hardly imagine that Jesus people and Christ people would ever be able to recognize one another, much less find a way to accommodate both types of social experimentation and mythology in a single configuration. And yet they tried. Mark's merger of the Kerygma with the Jesus traditions has already been mentioned. Mark was able to merge the two distinctly different traditions by identifying a conceptual bond common to both and use it to structure his composite account. The common concept was the relation of Jesus to the wisdom of God. Mark's genius was to use a form of wisdom mythology that could relate both to the Jesus traditions and to the Christ myth, and so mediate between them. The particular form of wisdom mythology he used was the wisdom tale of trial and vindication. The Jesus people had not made use of it, for they had no need or desire to reflect on questions pertaining to theodicy, little tongue twister for me, theodicy, and vindication. But they would certainly be familiar with the plot and were capable of seeing the connection to their own myths of Jesus as wisdom's child. For the Christ people, the logic of the wisdom tale was fundamental to their charisma, but they had not needed or dared to use it as a script for thinking about the historical circumstances of Jesus' death. Mark dared to use it and thus drew the Jesus traditions and the Christ traditions together at the point of the Passion narrative. We have already noted the reasons Mark had for thinking of Jesus' death in terms of judgment and vindication. Now we need to underscore the point that Mark's sympathies were still with the Jesus people, not with the Christ cult. He took from the Christ myth only what he needed in order to jockey his apocalyptic Jesus mythology into a dramatic and visual historical account of judgment against those who had rejected his Jesus group. He was not interested in the notion of a sacrificial death celebrated by means of a ritual meal and a cult of spiritual presence. He used the term Christ in its messianic connotation, not to refer to a cultic divinity. The Lord's Supper in Mark is simply the Last Supper of Jesus with his disciples, a time for disclosures, fond farewells, and predictions. It was not intended as an ideological script for a ritual reenactment by the Jesus people. The message of the empty tomb was not that Jesus was alive and available as a spiritual presence, but that Jesus was absent until the eschaton and that one should not go looking for him. So Mark walked a narrow line between the two types of mythology and apparently succeeded in persuading people in the Jesus traditions to consider Jesus as having been the Christ Messiah and to think of his death as a martyrdom for their cause. Mark's reduction of the Christ myth to terms compatible with the Jesus myths was an intellectual and literary accomplishment of truly historic proportions. It was not, however, the most imaginative uh, it was not, however, the most imaginative combination of the two traditions possible. That achievement took place in yet another Jesus tradition, one that I have not mentioned until now. The author of the Gospel of John wrote his novel account of Christian origins toward the end of the first century. He was solidly at home in a movement that had cultivated a peculiar style of discourse and created a most distinctive ethos. This movement started at an early time and appears to have had connections with the people who composed the miracle story sets. But in the course of a long and vigorous history, a community formed that found it possible to appropriate the views from many Jesus groups and turn them all into food for its own kind of thought. The community turned a set of miracle stories into quote unquote signs that signified the Jesus movement as the replacement for the Jewish religion. Much like the Thomas people, this community turned the sayings of Jesus into a highly developed discourse of encoded meanings of self reference both to Jesus and to themselves. They embellished the pronouncement story genre to create extended dialogues and monologues for Jesus, who spoke of himself as the Son of God in rhythmic and mesmerizing patterns of self revelation. And they had no trouble accepting the Gospel of Mark, the story of Jesus' death and resurrection, with its themes of judgment and vindication. The way in which the John people handled the Christ myth provides a distinctive twist of the gospel genre. Instead of downplaying the death and resurrection of the Christ as the moment when a new world of spiritual presence came into being, as Mark had done, the crucifixion was fixed upon as a moment in quote unquote history that revealed a divine world of life and light that had always been present but never clearly seen until Jesus, as the Son of God, made it known. The crucifixion was the Son's hour of glory, a, in parentheses, condescension to the darkened world of humankind and reascension of the Son to the Father. The distinction between Jesus' teachings and Christ's event coalesced in the Gospel of John, as did timeless presence and its location in history. The spiral like rhythms of the endless monologues of the self revealing Son of God, the logos of God or wisdom's child, a purposefully benumb to the reader. The whole point, according to the author of the Gospel, who expressly developed the theme of Jesus' self revelation as an offense to normal reasoning, was to cease making judgments and go with the flow, hearing and rehearsing the words of this Jesus would conjure up the imaginary world he created. Like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of John represents a community that was very close to becoming a Gnostic sect. The difference between the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of John is that by cultivating only the sayings of Jesus, Thomas created a noetic world of self referential presence that was detached from the social world. John developed a mythology that combined the time frame characteristic of the narrative gospels with the spiritual order created by the Christ myth. This was an auspicious stroke of imaginative genius. As any church historian knows, the Johannine image of Jesus at the center of a universe pulsating with the powers of light and darkness, the miraculous and the banal, is a very early projection of the mythic mentality that became characteristic of medieval Christianity. John pictured Jesus as the manifestation of God's Son from the realm of light, the very expression of God that created the world, but which repeatedly failed to find recognition until Jesus appeared. According to John, who used Mark's narrative to define the time and place of Jesus' appearance, the revealer was in the world from John the Baptist until the crucifixion. This attachment of the mythic world to human history in the story of Jesus has been a very important feature of Christian imagination and thought. This connection becomes tenuous, however, when Jesus' mythic role is primarily that of revealer of spiritual enlightenment. Whenever a Christian congregation of Johannine variety loses its own sense of attachment to the world at large, the attachment of the revealer to the time and place of the narrative gospel also can easily be severed. This is what happened in Gnostic circles, where the Gospel of John became the favorite narrative gospel. Not only was the Gospel of John read in these circles as if its setting were merely a once upon a time, the narrative frame was dropped as other accounts of Jesus's conversations with his disciples were written. One Gnostic ploy was to discount the narrative as history by placing the conversations in some ethereal setting at a time after Jesus' resurrection. But other Gnostic treatises imagined the revealer appearing in dreams or visions at any time and thus completely detached from any epic or historical frame of reference. From Q1 to the Gospel of John is a long, long way for the imagination of any movement to journey in such a short period of time. The myths that these people produced can only be called fantastic, but they settled in to play the dominant role in the shaping of the worldview basic to Western culture. A culture grows accustomed to its mythic universe. Attention is drawn to it only on certain occasions when the etiquettes of pious reference and attention prohibit critical expression, if not thinking. But now, observing this explosion of fantasy from a distance, and as historians interested in understanding the forces that generated such a mythology, we see that the times were right, the mythic resources ready, and that human ingenuity was fully capable of such novel creations. This account of early Christian mythmaking has revised the traditional picture puzzle of Christian origins by making three moves. One has been to underscore the many forms of early Christian mythology. The second has been to take multi formation as evidence of intellectual labor. And the third is to see the variations in myths or Christologies as evidence for vigorous social experimentation. The attraction of the social formations in the early Jesus movements and congregations of the Christ has largely been left out of account in previous descriptions of early Christianity. But as it turns out, it was hardly the myth or the message that generated Christianity. It was the attraction of participating in a group experimenting with a new social vision. So ends part 4.12, I think 4.2, sorry, 4.1. Uh, yeah, I'm getting myself mixed up here. Sorry, 4.2. Myth making and the Christ. From reading from the book The Lost Gospel, the Book of Q and Christian Origins by Burton L. Matt. So stay tuned for part 4.3, Bishops and the Bibles next. If you listened so far, I want to thank you and good day.